All right, welcome to my second of two videos on the Nikon N65, also called the U and the F65. Let's jump into how to do all of this stuff with this camera, which is fully electronic, so we can do nothing whatsoever without first putting in batteries. So to change batteries, what we're going to do is we're going to slide this lock toward the front of the grip while we lift up a little bit. And there's also a bit of a spring at the bottom of the battery chamber that will help us. Now we take out the two batteries that were in it, okay? Battery chamber should be clean. You can see possibly, nope, now might be able to see there. There's a guide on the inside of the battery chamber for how to load them, but I'll just spoil it so you don't have to look it up. Positive terminal of the battery goes toward the bottom of the camera like that. So you can see the little bump on the battery. Now, these plastic doors are getting a little bit old, so I'm going to give you a tip to prolong them and not break them when you load the battery. Slide the lock in and then press down on it. I might not be strong enough to do this. There you go. And now that the lock is slid in, and since you pull it in and then push it down, that's going to prevent this from getting broken when you close the battery door. If this battery door gets broken, you're going to have to buy a replacement, take off the bottom of the camera, put the new one in. It's kind of a pain to do it. Just as a heads up that you might end up, you want to preserve that because it's better to not have to replace that than to have to replace it. Okay, awesome. We're done. We can go now, right? Not quite. A few more things. We have batteries in the camera. Let's talk about how to replace lenses, so you know what to do when you have multiple lenses. To remove a lens, you push down on the lens release button and turn this clockwise until you can't anymore. Remove it. Now you've taken off the lens. Black index, red index, it'll be in a little bit of a different spot depending on the lens make. This is a Sigma lens. Nikon lenses are somewhere else. Or infinity focus mark. Some Nikon lenses do not have an index, they just use the infinity focus mark, which lines up with the black dot. Black dot, infinity focus mark. Turn it counterclockwise until it clicks into place, and now you're ready to go. Now this can use different types of Nikon lenses, and there's a whole boatload of them. In general, I'm going to recommend using the Nikon autofocus lenses of the era. The reason being, that's what these were designed for. So basically you're talking about Nikon AFD, I think is the designation for them. You have aperture control, focus control, and you don't have to do any kind of weird stuff to get them to work. This does not have an aperture linkage on it. Some Nikon cameras have an aperture linkage ring around here. Because this does not have an aperture linkage, you can use Nikon NAI lenses without damaging this camera if you would like to. You want to make sure that that lens is stopping down. But when you take your meter readings, you'll only be able to do it in manual focus, or full manual mode rather, with your depth of field preview. I guess technically you could do it in the other modes. Anyway, the off topic is that you can use NAI or pre-AI lenses. They just add a layer of complexity that you may not necessarily want to deal with, especially if you're just starting out in film photography. All right, so we've got a lens mounted, we've got a battery in the camera, we're ready to go take photos if we load film. Okay, so to load film, any 35mm film will work. In general, you want film, and most film has this, with a DX code here. A DX code basically looks like a black and silver checkerboard pattern right along here in the camera, and those pins inside will read that code. What you do is you put the film in this way. The motion is you kind of angle it in like that, and then drop it into place. Because this little rewind rather, drive is retractable, so you want to let it retract a bit as you put it in. Pull out a leader, advance the leader over here to the orange index, close the camera, and it will advance to the first frame, just like that. That's how we load film. So as you're taking photos, the film's going to advance through the camera. Now, film is one and done, and you don't ever want to do this because film can record photons a single time in a controlled manner with the proper aperture and shutter speed to give you an image, or an uncontrolled manner, rather like this, in which the film will record every photon that reaches it until it can't record anymore. That happens instantaneously, and every photo that is outside of the film here will be erased. So opening your camera like this will ruin your film. But I want you to see what's happened as I've taken a handful of photos. You can see that this has been advanced through here, and it's being taken up on this spool over here, and that's the way that this is working. Basically, as you take photos, the spool advances the film, and probably shouldn't do that, but I am. It's okay. And it pulls the film out of the cassette. Then when you're done, it rewinds the film back into the cassette, which I'm not going to be able to do because I don't want to press down on the shutter there. Anyway, it rewinds the film into the cassette with the thing that I pushed down out of the way there, and then you send your film off to be developed or develop it yourself. If you get most of the way or part of the way through a roll of film and you realize you're not going to finish it, all you have to do is hold these two buttons down and the camera will start to rewind your film. I'm going to see if I can time this. I cannot. Dang it. Getting film out of this with this cassette with a leader retriever is getting very hard. Anyway, once you've either finished a roll of film and it rewinds automatically, or you force rewind it because you're done shooting for the day and you don't mind losing however many images are left on that roll, just pull it out. If you want to load another one, grab another roll of film, put it in, and keep shooting. Okay. If your camera... Oops. So one drawback about this camera is that if your film does not have a DX code on it like this one doesn't, this camera can't recognize what film speed it's shooting. And insofar as I know, there's no way to adjust the film ISO on this. If there is, and somebody else knows it, they'll mention it in the comments before too terribly long. I could not find a way to manually set the film ISO on this camera. So while we're looking at the top of the camera, let's talk about what some of these different buttons and functions do. We're going to start here on the mode dial because we're just going to go left to right. Not because it's the easiest, it's definitely not. But we're going to start here with auto green camera, sometimes called magic green box. Basically what this does is the camera is going to do everything for you. You'll put the film in, it will determine, does the flash need to fire? If yes, it will trigger it, pop it up and trigger it on its own. It will pick the shutter speed, the aperture, and just in all ways take all the control out of your hands. Program mode is similar, but with program mode you decide whether or not the flash is going to fire. Okay? Program mode, insofar as I know, cannot trigger the flash on its own. You can also, with program mode, do something called exposure value. You can also, in program mode, shift your exposure value. You can hold this button over here on the side, and you can force your camera to underexpose your photo by up to 2 stops, or overexpose it by up to 2 stops. Basically, that will allow you to shoot low key and high key, bracket your images, things like that. So in auto mode, you cannot do that. You have no control over what this camera is going to do. So program gives you back some of the control over the exposures. S stands for shutter priority. Basically, in this mode, you're going to select the shutter speed. As you might see here, I'm adjusting the shutter speed. And the camera will then pick the best aperture based on the shutter speed that you select. Okay, so it's a pretty easy thing. Aperture priority is the exact same thing, except the opposite. You select the aperture, and the camera will pick the best shutter speed. So shutter speed controls the time of the exposure. Aperture controls the opening within the lens, which is used to control depth of field. So I do 90% of my shooting or more in aperture priority. Most of my film shooting is actually full manual, but in digital, I'm almost exclusively aperture priority. And so it's a really easy way to have creative control over the way your images look, especially if you're using a camera where the shutter speeds are going to be in a range you can use with whatever aperture you have. So manual is full manual. Basically, if you rotate the dial, you're going to adjust the shutter speed. If you push the EV button down, you're going to adjust the aperture. Okay, and what this does is the camera will do what you tell it to do. And if you're exposure is perfect, it will give you a perfect photo. If your exposure is way off, it will give you a terrible photo. So manual, you have control, and the camera does what you say. There's a light meter inside the viewfinder, and there should be one on the, I guess there's not on the LCD, but there's a light meter in the viewfinder right here. And the way that this light meter works is in auto program aperture priority and shutter priority, that center dot under the 0 is pretty much always going to be lit up unless you force over or force underexpose the image. So if you tell the camera to overexpose by two stops, this will be lit up. But in P, S, and A, in general, your dot under the 0 will be illuminated. In manual mode, that's not necessarily true. And what can happen is that if you are one stop over, if you're at 1/125th and f5.6 and you need to be at f8, at f4 rather, -1, negatives on this side, will be illuminated, saying you don't have enough light. If you have a dot over here that's lit up, you do not have enough light. If this triangle down here is lit up, or lit up and blinking, I forget which it does, you have way not enough light, and you need to manually adjust your settings to get the block back under the 0. Same is true on this side, only that's your overexposure. You're giving the camera or the film way too much light if you have a light over here lit up or blinking. So with full manual, adjust your aperture and shutter speed as you see fit to get back down to the 0 with your meter reading. All right, so these really are where you should spend the most of your time. If you've come to this camera to learn photography or to become a better photographer or to advance from a cell phone or something like that, this is where you're going to spend most of your time, because this will let you make mistakes to varying extents. Manual will let you make all the mistakes in the world and then some I haven't thought of. But this will let you make some mistakes and teach you a lot about how a proper image exposure works. So I'm going to go through these modes right here to tell you what they do, with a caveat that you should really never use them, because what they will do is take a photo, make sure it turns out, and you won't really learn how or why. Okay. This first one is called night portrait mode. Basically, what this is going to do is give you a long exposure, and it should trigger the flash. The idea for this is that you would be taking a photo at night. You might have a friend sitting on a picnic table and the city behind them, and you can see the city lights or whatever, right? The way to make that scenario work with this is to make sure that your friend doesn't get up until the photo is completely done and the film advances, because what this should do is take a very long exposure, maybe half or 2 seconds, something like that, to capture the lights of the city, and also trigger the flash to illuminate your friend. And if that's happening, if your friend is being illuminated by the flash, and let's say the flash triggers right at the beginning of the photo, I think that's the case with this camera, and then they get up, well, what's going to happen is that the lights of the city behind them are going to show through, and it's going to be very distracting to your photo because it's going to be your friend with the city lights. So to make this work, make sure your friend doesn't get up until you tell them to and the photo is done. Action burst. Okay, action burst mode works best with the long lens of your kit zoom. So on this lens, it would be the 105 length. If you have like the 55 through 200 or something, you'd want to use it around 200. This is going to give you a wide aperture, a fast shutter speed, as fast as the camera can give you, and shoot in burst mode so that you can capture an action sequence. To make the most of this mode, make sure you're shooting a fast film like 400 or 800, or even better, if you have a black and white film like a Tri-X or something like that, you have pushed it to 1600, and that will help you get the most out of this mode. Close-up is also intended to use the long end of your zoom, although if you have the 55 to 200 as a separate example, shoot at around the 55 to 85. What this does is this will get the camera to focus at the closest part of the focus range on something close up. With these two modes, I believe that the flash will not fire. I believe that's correct. But at any rate, with this one, you're going to use this mode if you're trying to get something like a flower in the frame, and you're going to get as close as you can to it. This mode is called landscape. With this mode, you want to use the widest end of your lens, in this case 28 millimeters with this lens. This mode will give you a deep depth of field by shooting at f16 or f22 to try to get stuff that's in the foreground as well as the distant background in focus and give you a good landscape photo. And this last mode is called Portrait. This is best at the longer end of your zoom again. 105 would actually be pretty much perfect for this mode. So this is designed to take portraits of people. I'm going to give you a couple tips to make the most of this. You want to have your person about 9 to 10 feet in front of the background behind them if possible. That will help this camera make the background blurry and your person in sharp focus. The camera is going to try to get your person from nose to earlobes or a little bit further back in focus so that their face and shoulders and everything is in focus, and try to blur the background, and you can help do that by giving the camera some space. So I'm going to switch this to full manual mode for pretty much the rest of the video so I can adjust things as needed. We talked about the self-timer. This is the bracket button, and what you can do with the bracket button is push it down, and now you can see over here that different stuff is happening, and I'm going to try to interpret this while I'm looking at it upside down. 0.5, 1, 1, 5, 2 are your stops of bracketing. Okay. Basically, what those do is that's going to give you separate images separated by multiple photos. I believe it's 3. 2 stops under, proper exposure, 2 stops over. 1 stop under, proper, 1 stop over. Okay. And that flashing, the bracket symbol there indicates that it's bracketing is on, and the flash symbol indicates that the camera is going to need a flash to do a proper bracket. So, is that? Nope, I take that back. That was not the flash symbol. That's the exposure value compensation button symbol, meaning that your exposure value is adjusted. I'm going to show you a really neat trick with this. We're going to go back to 0 here. I'm going to go to exposure value compensation, and we're going to go 1 stop under. We're going to bracket to 1 stop. What that's going to do is that's going to make 1 stop under what your camera thinks is proper exposure. So you're still going to get 3 photos. They will be 2 stops under, 1 stop under, proper. Now this is a really useful way to bracket if you think your scene is very, very bright and you need to cut some light out of it. Or if you want to just kind of experiment with that and see how shadows and highlights work with different exposures, you can do that too. But this is a thing you can do. You can shift your bracketing, you can shift your exposure rather, up to 2 stops in either direction, and then you can still bracket up to 2 stops, so you can use those in concert. Holding down the bracket button and shifting past 2 brings you to the multiple exposure function, right? Okay, so this will allow you to take multiple exposures. And basically, did I set that at 30th? Oh, hold on, let me set this back to manual. Okay, so basically what happens is it's going to take 2 photos and then advance. So if we switch to double exposures, and you can push this button and just scroll once in the other direction away from the bracketing setting to get straight to double exposures, it'll take 2 photos. Okay, but 2 photos really isn't enough. What if I wanted to take like 30? Hold it down, double, hold it down, double, hold it down, double, hold it down, double. There you go. Over and over. And then you can just keep doing that. The camera will automatically advance the film when you're done. If you are going to do double exposures, you do want to, in any of the manual modes, you do want to make sure that you compensate your, nope. You do want to make sure, if you're going to do a double exposure, that you underexpose your film by 1 stop for each of the 2 double exposures, because film is meant to receive a certain amount of light, a certain number of, and if you hit it with 2 exposures worth of light, the negatives are going to be hard to develop, hard to digitize. They're going to have a lot of noise, a lot of very long print time, low contrast. So if you're going to do a double exposure, make sure you go 1 under for both exposures, triple exposure, quadruple exposure, just as a guide. Okay, usually we do that at the very end of the video. Oops. Next thing we're going to talk about is flash use with the Nikon N65. Okay, so there are two ways to use the flash on this camera. One is with the pop-up flash right here. The worst possible place to put a flash, by the way, is directly on top of the lens, pointing directly at your subject. We'll talk about why in a second. The other thing you can do is use the hot shoe and plug a flash into the camera's hot shoe just like that. These are the two ways that you can use a flash. Now, as I said, the worst possible place to point your flash, to have your flash, is like this, because the light will leave the flash in a flat burst, reach your subject, bounce back to your lens, and it will make your subjects look flat and waxy. If you're using color film, it can also cause red eye in your subjects. None of that is flattering. So here are some tips I'm going to give you about how to make the most out of your flash. The first is that your flash should replicate natural light. So think about the way that we see the world. If you're outside, what we see is lit by the sun, which is above us, or at night by street lights, which are above us. If you're indoors, the lights are in the ceiling above us. So everywhere that we are, we're used to lights being above what we're looking at. So we think of light from above as being natural and flattering. So if you do put a flash like this in the hot shoe, if you get one that can tilt up, now you can bounce the light off of the ceiling and get light that looks more natural and is more flattering to your subject, okay? There are also ones that, in addition to the flash tilting up like this, articulate and rotate side to side, and that will allow you to bounce off of a wall, for instance, if you have no ceiling, okay? So that's a really good way to do that. And having a flash that will allow you to bounce off of a ceiling will really give you a lot of control for giving you some flattering subject lighting. The next thing is use a Nikon flash or a Nikon compatible third party, because it will communicate with the camera up here and help with some automatic flash power. I am not a Nikon flash expert. I actually don't think I've ever owned a Nikon flash because I don't use flashes on film cameras very often. But at any rate, the point of that is if you use a Nikon system flash which has compatible functions, then you will get the most out of your flash use with this camera. Really strongly recommend avoiding getting a third-party flash that may or may not work properly with this. It'll just make it a bit easier to have a good Nikon flash. So the next thing that we're going to do is look at what is in the viewfinder. Okay, if I can get this centered. There we go. So when you look through the viewfinder of your camera, you're going to see something that looks rather like this. Okay, this is everything that could potentially be lit up, and we'll go through that in a second. This is where you're going to compose and frame your image up here. So if it is in this area, you're going to have it on your film. You'll even get a little bit outside of your film, as we talked about in the first video, but try to get your entire image inside of this box. These 5 areas are your autofocus points. Okay, and what those will do is flash to tell you which autofocus point is being used by the camera for your image. So if you just have a person's face in the middle here, and these are lighting up, then you know your person's going to be in focus. But if you have like a soccer field, right, and you've got a large span of people, you've got one kid running over here and the other one's on the opposite end of the field over here, well, which one of these lights up is going to tell you which kid is going to be in focus, okay? So that's what that's telling you. This right here is your center-weighted metering circle. Okay, so one thing I know I was going to talk about center-weighted metering mode versus matrix metering mode. There is no way to manually select which mode is going to be used with the camera. The camera will automatically pick between center-weighted and matrix based on which of these you choose, and if it was in the manual as to which mode uses which, I didn't see it. My best guess is that portrait is going to use center weighted because most people will center focus or center compose their subjects. Probably also the same thing with close focus. But basically, when you're using different modes on the mode dial, the camera will automatically pick between matrix and center weighted. Okay, so that's what all the information on the screen means. This is your focus confirmation dot. If this lights up when you're looking through the viewfinder, the camera's telling you, hey, I've got focus. this is your autofocus confirmation indicator, and this will tell you which autofocus point of these is being used. And what you do for this is on the side of the camera here, you have this button, right? And this button will allow you, in concert with the command wheel, and you can see it on the top here on the LCD, to select a single different autofocus point, okay? And it will go through these 5 correspond with these 5 up here. So if only the center one is lit up, only the center is being used. If this one on the side is lit up, this one's being used. The camera can only use one autofocus point at a time, apparently. Didn't know that a few minutes ago. Anyhow, you can then manually select it. Why is that useful? Let's say that you want to frame an image where you're at the soccer game, right? And you want to have your kid here kicking a ball at the goal. Your kid's going to be here, the goal's going to be over here. You would then manually pick this autofocus point by pushing down this button and adjusting the command wheel until this is lit up. This autofocus point is going to be used. You then would make sure you're in burst mode with your sports setting, because everything else is single shooting, I believe. And then line your kid up on this. As they get close to the opposing goal, you're going to start your burst mode shooting and catch them as they kick, and hopefully they'll be in focus as the ball is going into the goal, right? And you get the nice goalie diving shot and all that jazz. Okay. The other thing you can do is select one of these and shoot in portrait orientation mode for portraits. Line up the bridge of your subject's nose on this focus point, and then all of your subjects will have the same focus point right here on the bridge of their nose. So that's how you can use autofocus points to great advantage. Shutter speed number, seconds indicator, so if you're at 1 second up to 30, that will be on. f8.8, this is, well, I mean, this says your aperture. It's not just 8.8, that's just the mark I have there. But shutter speed and aperture indicator, meter, we talked about how to use that with full manual mode already. Exposure compensation is on indicator. Flash is on indicator in there. So that's what's in the viewfinder and how to read all of it. And the last thing that we have to talk about with the Nikon N65 is how to take a photo. So you're going to dial in all of your settings, right? You can set up this however you want, have your film loaded, your lens loaded, have all of the settings that you want to have dialed in first. Look through the viewfinder, focus, and take your photo. It's that simple. The way that this camera is designed is you do your setup ahead of time. That way, there's no lag between when you want to take the photo and when you do. So that's it. That's everything in this camera. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in whatever camera manual comes next.